Connect with other utility operators at any time by clicking on the Connect symbol. Water, our most precious resource. Our communities depend on utility operators to sustain and preserve this vital resource. How do you ensure your utility is sustainable for your children and grandchildren? How do you foster a win-win situation for your utility and your customers? The tools of asset management can set you up for success. The central idea of asset management is to maintain a desired level of service at the lowest possible cost. Asset management involves 5 components. The first is knowing your assets. The second is setting level of service goals. Third, knowing which assets are critical. Fourth, life cycle costing. And fifth, long-term funding. Please listen to Carlos and Heather as they discuss more on the topic of asset management.
So Heather, I have heard this term asset management. I really don't know much about it. Can you please tell me more?
Sure. When you run a water, wastewater, or stormwater utility, you have to make decisions every single day on what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. So you're going to have a system that's made up of a whole bunch of assets. And when things happen with those assets, you have to decide, am I going to repair it, replace it, rehabilitate it? What operation and maintenance am I going to do? And these decisions all impact money. You know, how much is it going to cost me if I make this decision or that decision? So one way to make those decisions is to just do it on the fly and not think too much about it. But that might be really uncomfortable because then you don't know if you're spending your customers' money the best way possible, if it's the most efficient operation, the most efficient financially. So you really want a better way to figure out how to make those decisions. And asset management is that process that helps you make better decisions. And simply put, it's trying to meet the customer's desired level of service at the lowest overall life cycle cost.
What are the components of asset management?
Well, there's 5 major components of asset management. And the first is the current state of the assets. The second is level of service. The third is criticality. The fourth is life cycle costing. And the fifth is long-term funding. And if we think of those in just simple terms, it's really what do I have? What do I want it to do? What's the most critical to doing it? How should I maintain those things over their lifespan? And how am I going to fund that going forward?
How can I figure out what assets I have?
Well, the way we do that is an asset inventory where we usually start with some kind of simple mapping exercise where we're going to go out in the field and those assets that we can see or at least have some indication of on the ground, like a manhole or a valve cover, a meter cover, a hydrant. We're going to go out and find a location, usually through GPS or cell phone technology. There's lots of options out there nowadays, lots of free options. We'll go out and take the location of those assets. And then we'll try to get a list of asset attributes, things like the manufacturer, the date you installed it, the asset ID, the condition, so that we can collect a whole bunch of information about our assets. And now we'll know what we have in the system. And it might sound like it's a really hard thing to do, but it's actually not as bad as it first appears. So it's kind of a good place to start, just getting a map and knowing what assets you have.
How do I know what I want my assets to do?
So that's what we call in asset management terms level of service. So this is where we start sitting down and thinking about the goals we have for our utility. What do we want our utility to do for our customers? Thankfully in the water business, there's not a lot of goals that we really need to set. Our customers are pretty simple. They want water to be there 24/7, 365. They want it to be safe. They want it to be reliable. They want some customer service. So a few goals set will pretty much do the trick. And we usually try to use something called SMART. So the goals are specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. And that way we can see if we've actually met the goals and we can let our customers know how well we're doing to meeting what they want.
How do I determine which assets are critical to my utility's sustained performance?
Well, this is where we really get into a risk assessment. So we're going to look at 2 major factors. And the first is what's the probability or likelihood that an asset will fail? And then the second one is what's the consequence if the asset does fail? We multiply those together to get the criticality score. So we typically rank maybe 1 to 5 in the probability of failure, 1 to 5 in consequence. And then to get the risk, we multiply those together. And those assets that have the highest criticality score are the ones that we really want to be looking out for, doing the operation and maintenance on, replacing before they fail, things like that. So it helps us figure out where to spend our money to have a much bigger bang for the buck that we put in.
What does life cycle costing entail?
That's when we look at the asset over its full life cycle. So we're starting, if we go all the way back to designing the asset, when we're first contemplating what the asset is going to be like, we have an opportunity to really input into how that asset is going to behave in the future. Then we install it during a construction process, and then we operate it, maintain it. It'll hit a point where it needs replacing or repairing. So throughout its whole life, we're trying to figure out what interventions are best in the life of that asset. And we need to remember not to forget that design and construction phase, because that's where we can have a lot of impact ahead of time before it's a very expensive thing. If you install it properly during the construction phase, it'll save you a lot of costs later on. So we try to think about the whole lifespan of the asset and what's the most efficient way to handle that asset over its entire life.
Why should I consider long-term funding?
Well, the reason we want to think about long-term funding is all of our utilities are very long-lived. We might have pipe in the ground for 100 or 125 years. So these assets last a really long time. If we're only thinking about the funding over maybe 1, 2, 3, or even 5 years, we're forgetting what's happening way into the future. These assets are also really expensive, so if we're not thinking about them long-term, we're going to find ourselves in a lot of trouble 10 years, 20 years down the road because we've underfunded the utility, and it will cost us a lot of money to catch up. So the longer we can think, the better off we will be. So we usually try to say at least 20 years, but 50 to 100 years is even better to really think about what's going to happen over the life of that asset, or over the life of your utility.
Okay, well, thank you, Heather, for explaining asset management. I learned a lot from that.
Thank you. Now go ahead and start implementing.
The 5 core components of asset management are knowing your assets, setting level of service goals, knowing which assets are critical to your system, life cycle costing, and long-term funding. Water, our most precious resource. Our communities are grateful to utility operators for sustaining and preserving this vital resource. Please connect with other utility operators to share information. This video was made possible by SWEFC.